It's my pleasure to welcome again Peter Loggins. And tonight we're going to talk about 100 years of the Savoy Ballroom as a cultural hub. So important to Lindy Hop, to the dancing that we do currently today. So I'm passing the microphone, Mr. Peter Loggins.
Thank you, brother. All right. Welcome all. As he said, it's a special year. 100th anniversary of the Savoy Ballroom opening. And it's kind of thinking about it over the last, I've been dancing for 30 years now. And we've lived through a lot of these 100-year celebrations. In 2014, it was the 100th year celebration of the Foxtrot, which is probably the biggest, most popular dance that came out of America. What's another one? Of course, we have, I guess you could say also this year kind of would be as well the 100th year celebration of when the Charleston became very big, although it 2 years ago would have been better. 2017 was the 100th year anniversary of the first jazz recording, or recording of music by a band using the term jazz with the... But so we're getting a lot of these. But the Savoy is a very special one, of course, as he mentioned, not only for the dance, but the music. But so I'm going to just talk about some tidbits of... Everybody in here, I'm sure, has already gone on Wikipedia or Google and got a good idea of what the Savoy Ballroom was all about and its importance, at least to on the grander scale of things that we all know it as. But there's a lot of little things I'd like to maybe mention or talk about as well that might be not as easy to dig up, even though it's all out there. For instance, the first couple of years of the Savoy, first off, the Savoy opened in March of 1926, and for the first few years, obviously, the Lindy Hop in the very beginning hadn't even been invented yet. Or created by Matty Purnell and George Snowden, Shorty George Snowden, and even after it was created, the dance itself was. There's a historian who's no longer with us anymore, sadly, Terry Monaghan. He was a British historian and researcher who sadly passed away, but he was probably the #1 historian and researcher on the subject of, very specifically, the Savoy Ballroom as a building, as an institution, because it linked so many social and cultural aspects of Harlem under this building. Dance is just one thing. The music, so many different things came into contact with the presence of the importance of the Savoy Ballroom. But one of the interesting things is you were not even allowed to do Lindy Hop or any type of eccentric dancing in the Savoy Ballroom for its first few years, for a couple reasons. The biggest reason is when you have a customer base of thousands of people traveling around a dance ballroom floor, the last thing you want is some stationary eccentric dancers in the way. It's not unique to the Savoy. This was a problem across America for all ballrooms. As the shift slowly happened from the popularity of traveling dances to stationary dances. There was unwritten rules in ballroom that stationary dancers usually go to the center of the floor. In some rare situations, the corners as well. But this is something that all ballrooms had to deal with. And one really funny story that happened, I can think of one particular instance anyways. There was a ballroom in San Diego, California, and their solution for these eccentric dancers, swing dancers, was they created they actually took a chain link fence, and they made a cage in the middle of the ballroom floor. So if you're a jitterbug or a swing dancer, you go into that cage. And that would leave all the traveling dancers, so there wouldn't be a conflict of interest. Of course, eventually, people learned, and Lindy Hop, of course, became center to and most popular at the Savoy Ballroom. But at the same time, people have to understand that it was the music as well, the quality of music that they hired for the Savoy. There was no shortcuts at all when the Savoy was built, and it was built by some well-known and very successful developers. A guy by the name of Fagan and another guy by the name of Mo Gale Buchanan, and then they hired a manager. And they had already been very successful in their ballrooms in both Chicago and in downtown New York with the Roseland Ballroom. So when they opened the Harlem had a vacuum, you could say. While there was a lot of ballrooms already up there, there was nothing spectacular and nothing as big or glamorous as the Savoy Ballroom. So when they did open the Savoy, they put everything into it to make it absolutely number one, the finest, and that's what the reputation was. They called it the finest ballroom in the world. Some of the things leading up to its being so spectacular was not only the amount of money they put into it and the no cutting of corners, but on Saturdays, every Saturday after its opening day, they gave away a brand new car. Like I said, they did hire the opening bands. One of the bands, and the music is more the closer thing, is closer to my heart. And the two bands that they actually had opening was Fess Williams and his Royal Flush Orchestra, and another band called the Charleston Bearcats. And after about a week of playing, or the second week of playing at the Savoy Ballroom, they weren't only hired for opening night, but they actually were booked as house bands for a period of time. And of course, the Charleston Bearcats changed their name to the Savoy Bearcats. And it was because it was such a huge deal to have this new ballroom. Another great orchestra named Fletcher Henderson, many of you know the name Fletcher Henderson, he was already booked down at Roseland Ballroom. So after playing at Roseland Ballroom, they got off work, they went uptown to Harlem, and they also played the Savoy they continued playing the Savoy Ballroom at something like 1 or 2 in the morning and continued the party going. So they had a major support of top quality bands. And that's the kind of the music, to be honest with you guys, is the music that's closest to my heart, is that late 20s, to me, is the hottest of the hot, good dance band music, because it's so exciting. The arrangements are exciting, the stops, the syncopations, the rhythms. It's, to me, it's kind of like, the music became easier and easier to dance to throughout the 30s until it just became this flat, what I consider a flat, simple swing rhythm in which individuals got to solo over and show off their talent. Of course, I'm talking mostly about the Count Basie Orchestra and people like Lester Young. But previous, these early Savoy years, it was absolute teamwork with the bands. The whole band was a rhythm section, and the arrangements were not easy arrangement. They were very difficult to play as a musician. So I'm very fascinated with that, with the bands. Many years ago, I did some research and put together, or tried to put together an album of just house bands of the Savoy Ballroom, because the Savoy would hire the best of the best bands to come in and be resident bands for a period of time, for weeks and weeks and weeks on time. And then while they had their house bands, of course, representing their regular schedule, they would have guest bands, one-nighters, two-nighters coming in as well. And many of you already know the stories that when one band stopped, the next band would start up. So there was no downtime between, like today, we always go to a DJ, you know. There was no DJs back then. So one stage had the band, and the next band that's ready to go on, they'd be setting up and be prepared to play. So when that band went off, the next band would start. And what this created was an atmosphere of what would be called Battle of the Bands. It wasn't necessarily unique just to the Savoy Ballroom. There was these situations kind of going on in other places as well, but nothing so spectacular as the Savoy Ballroom, which really, really hyped up these Battle of the Bands. And I can think of many situations where they made the papers, and there was all kinds of people talking about them, and critics and music critics. Now, one of the questions I always got was, how did they decide who the winner was of these battles? There was no necessarily voting system. It was pretty much just word of mouth, who you thought was the better of the men. There was no official. And one of those examples, I could say, was with Frankie Manning. And because there was there's many famous battles there, but one of the more famous ones was, of course, Chick Webb and Count Basie. And while all the newspapers seem to say Chick Webb won that battle, Count Basie's like, nah, man. Frankie Manning, he was like, no, Basie all the way. It was Basie all the way. So it really gets down to the flavor in which what you really liked. And also there was a little bit, because Chick Webb, for those of you who don't know who Chick Webb was, of course, he was a native Harlemite, and of course his band is what gave rise to the first to hire Ella Fitzgerald. And he wasn't the healthiest. He had a very bad spine problem, and sadly he died far too young because of it. But there was a lot of, but because he was such a king on those drums with his band, there was a lot of, you couldn't really beat him, let's just say, because he was Chick Webb, you know. And this is something that Gene Krupa, who playing drums with Benny Goodman's orchestra, talked about. Like, you know, he would always, even though Gene Krupa was probably a much more talented drummer, even Gene Krupa would bow to the likes of people like Chick Webb, because he was so highly respected as not just a musician, but as a person. But another thing that's really interesting is the Savoy Ballroom. It was 1926 to 1958 is when it closed down. So it had multiple generations of customers, multiple generations of dancers, multiple generations of musicians, of employees, and that's something we don't really take into consideration when we talk about it, especially in the Lindy scene. Of course, the Lindy scene, we're let's just say we're focused on the Lindy, what I call the Lindy era. And what is the Lindy era? To me, the Lindy era, I'm thinking more in the terms of like pop American culture. And what I mean by that is the word Lindy Hop doesn't become known across America, if at all, until around 1935 or 1936. Before that, any remnant or any style of dancing that you would see that looks like this would either be called the East Coast, or they'd call it the New Yorker, or they didn't know the name of the dance, so they would give it a regional descriptive term or name, not knowing. But slowly the name would pop up, whether it be in newspapers or in different, or even word of mouth, or even in lyrics. And so the name becomes commonly known in the mid-30s, where everybody kind of knows what this is. And then, of course, we have also the major competition of the Harvest Moon Ball dance competition. And that was, of course, sponsored by the newspaper in New York. And they would have preliminary contests in all the ballrooms in New York. So they had Roseland Ballroom, they had the Avedon Ballroom, they had the Glen Island Casino, and the Savoy Ballroom. They had four different competitions. They take the 5 best of these ballrooms, and they'd all come together to compete for the Harvest Moon Ball. And because there was so many people in it, so many people to see this competition, over 20,000 people, that they had it at Madison Square Garden. And that starts in 1935. And that is not just Lindy Hop. That is actually several different types of dances. The waltz, the foxtrots, I believe rumba was a category as well. And then they added a category of shag, collegiate shag, for a few years. And the point I'm getting at is, in this big, massive competition, the category was called the Lindy Hop. And needless to say, the Savoy Ballroom dancers went on to win every single first years. But the name changes in 1941. They changed the contest from Lindy Hop to Jitterbug, or Jitterbug Jive. Why? We'll never really know the actual, but we can take a look at a lot of different other things and kind of come to at least let's just say an educated conclusion of a possibility why. But we have to remember 1941 is also the year of Hellzapoppin'. But the movie Hellzapoppin', the dancers in that movie, they were not promoted or billed or advertised as Lindy Hoppers. They were actually billed as Congaroo dancers. And in newspapers of that same time, there's many various articles coming out saying, look at this new dance. However, they're just doing the Lindy Hop. So that's a very curious thing. If we take a step back and we think about the Lindy Hop in just its first 15 years, or I would say 10 years to be a little more accurate, let's say for right now, we'll use 1929 as a starting date, only because we have an idea of what it looks like on film, even though, of course, it starts shortly thereafter Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. But if we look at the dance in 1929, what we see is obviously all 8 counts. We see no syncopations as far as triple steps goes. We see very linear dancing. We do see the breakaway or the swing out, whatever you want to call it. But we see a very distinct style of dancing, even though these 3 couples that are on that film all have their own flavor, so to say. And then if you take a look at the progress of the dance, we have 1932. We have a Vitaphone short from 32 where we have some small swing outs. Not a lot, but there's a little bit there. And you can kind of see the leader do a little bit of syncopation on the 3 and 4, just a little bit. But they're keeping that same upright, smaller style swing out going. And then we can also look at all the Harvest Moon Ball clips starting from 1935. While they're very short, of course, there's a good snapshot of what they were doing on stage, which is not the best representation for social dancing, but nonetheless, it's a good idea of what the dance was all about, for sure. We also have Day at the Races, 1937, and then just to give it 10 years and put it to 1939, we have the motion picture called Keep Punchin', where you have, which is it's a nice clip because number one, the interesting thing is all the couples come, it's supposed to be a contest, but it's a movie, it's a mock contest. What happens is, it's our favorite team, Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, but they're dancing one couple at a time. They swing out into the circle, they do their shtick, their trademark moves, whoever that couple might be. And then, but in the background, you have all the other couples, they continue dancing. And the neat thing about that clip is they're all dancing halftime, with very syncopated triple steps. So it's a really cool look into what the dance looks like if you're not dancing to the actual tempo of the song, but you're actually cutting it in half. And there's 2 reasons that's really nice. Number one, for one thing, it's a great way to survive if you're out social dancing and the song is really fast. For some reason, there's not a lot of people that like to enjoy dancing halftime, or that never dawned on them they're allowed to dance halftime. That's one thing that's really cool. But as far as the production value of the dance scene in itself, it's nice because it shows contrast of the dancers that are swinging out into the circle that they're spotlighting. They're dancing full time. So of course it's very fast, it's frantic, it's crazy swing outs, it's great moves, but everybody else is halftime. So there's a really nice contrast to really spotlight. And then, of course, we also have, like I said, Day at the Races was 2 years before. Norma Miller, she says, around 1938 is when Whitey's Lindy Hoppers invented what they called mutiny. And what's mutiny? Mutiny is the ability to do air step after air step after air step with no basics. Boom, 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 boom. And we get an idea of what that's like in many of these clips. And so the point of my reviewing the 10 years of this dance, there's really no relationship between what was going on in 1929 at the beginning of the dance and what happens in 1938 or 39 with Mutiny. There's really nothing in common. We can take it even farther. We can look at a clip. Well, let's not take it too far yet. Herbert White. He was a bouncer at the Savoy Ballroom. He's an important figure, obviously, because he had the mind of let's just say even though he was a bouncer at the Savoy Ballroom, he had the mind of a capitalist, and he saw these young, little, talented kids and said, I can make some money off these kids. They're good. So what did he do? He put together a team of them and started hiring them out. Thankfully to him, they became, of course, it didn't take long, as they say, for Hollywood to call. And they get to, here's these poor young black kids from Harlem that are very, very talented in what they do, and they're able to be featured in some of the bigger motion pictures of that time period, especially Day at the Races, which is, of course, a Marx Brothers film. So it's a very you can't get more mainstream than that. So they go from really nothing to something that, thankfully, that blessed the world, that they were documented in some of these motion pictures. And, of course, Hell's a-Poppin' as well. Hell's a-Poppin' wasn't necessarily as big as a movie as some people make it out to be. And also, something to keep in mind is when normal people saw dancing like what they were doing in Hell's a-Poppin' in 1941, normal people, it didn't make them think, oh, I'm going to go learn that. No, that's a freak thing that we do, right? 100 years, 80 years later or whatever. It's not that it didn't affect people, it did. I knew dancers in Los Angeles that sat in the movie theaters, both for Day at the Races. I knew people, like, I talk about, like, Hal Takir is most famous for this, him and Betty. They would sit in the motion picture movie theater waiting for the dance scene and then just take frantic notes. And then they'd have to wait for intermission, for the movie to start again, and wait for that whole dance scene to come back and take notes again. And then they would run home and they would practice what they took notes upon. And what they ended up doing is something completely different, but they didn't have stop, rewind, and slow motion. So dancers that were into swing dancing wherever they lived in America, yes, that did inspire them to take moves and to steal ideas for sure. Then there's plenty of clips as well in the early 40s. Starting in 1939, there was a company by the name of the Soundy Distributor of America. And what they did is they did music videos. Today we just call them Soundies. But they were just very cheap, for the most part, cheap budget, one-day shot films. They would string 16 of these together, loop them together on a reel, film reel. And they were put in a small, well, it looked like it's an upright booth. It looks like a cigarette machine, and you could put a dime in it, and it would play one of these music videos. They were all over America for about almost 2 years, almost. But then World War II broke out, and they weren't allowed to make the amount of machine. I think they did 80,000 machines the first year, but because of the war, it was down to 50,000 and then 20,000. So that's number one. Number two came the musician strike in 42. So now they couldn't hire the Basie or Ellington or Good. They couldn't hire the A-line, top A bands. They had to get B bands, lesser bands. So in other words, Soundies just got hit with all these tragedies, unfortunately. So they went from making really, really great films to cheaper, a lot of bicycle tricks and dog tricks and not as good dancing, let's just say. But there's a handful of excellent ones. But they were not Lindy Hoppers. Everything became jitterbugging. And as I mentioned, Herbert White, once World War II broke out, it stole most of the good dancers. Frankie, Al Mims, Leon James, most of these dancers all went to war. So he was left, he didn't have much to pull from. But he did, and he started a new troupe I think in 43, but they were called Whitey's Jitterbugs. So it went from Whitey's Lindy Hoppers to Whitey's Jitterbugs. So getting back to the very beginning, when I talk about the Lindy Hop era, I'm talking primarily of 1935 to like 1939 or 1940, when it was all over America. Everybody knew what that term was all about. And also those dancers, it's true, they did call themselves Lindy Hoppers. But we have to think about the context and think about the context of those specific dancers. They were all born between 1915 and 1921. We're talking about Norma and Frankie and Al. And they come from nothing, number one. Number two, they finally get old enough, 18, to get into the Savoy Ballroom. They could become extremely talented. They don't have much going on for them economically in Harlem at that time. We also have to remember, this is the middle of the Depression, if not the worst years of the Depression, the early 30s. And all of a sudden, they're getting pimped out to go dance here, private party here, function, Apollo Theater, performance. So they were very proud of the fact that they came from this background of Harlem, but now they're known for this dance that they've learned, the Lindy Hop. So they were proud. I'm a Lindy Hopper. It meant something. Very, very important. It meant something. It's very different than today, where you just learn a dance and then you call yourself a dancer, whatever that might be. And this is important because the following generation, I can think of Jesse Blue Outlaw and, Jesse Blue Outlaw, who is also many of these dancers are filmed in The Spirit Moves it was filmed in 1950 to 51. So you have a lot of the second generation Savoy dancers and third generation Savoy dancers, like Sugar Sullivan, who's still alive. Sonny Allen, still alive. Of course, Barbara, and there's Dickie Harris. But they didn't call themselves Lindy Hoppers. They were dancers. Because Tuesday night or Wednesday night, they would be downtown dancing at the Palladium doing mambo. And then mambo became such a huge thing that Savoy Ballroom opened it up on Tuesday nights, was their Latin night. So they did all kinds of dances. Not only that, but they danced to the music in a different way than we do today. Frankie didn't always Lindy Hop. Frankie talked about this quite openly when he's sitting in what they called Cat's Corner of the Savoy Ballroom. And by Cat's Corner was the corner in which the locals would hang out. You know, when the locals they would always go to the one corner that their friends would be at. And back then, by cats, they meant hep cats. You know, it's a slang terminology. Today, we make it kind of cheesy, but it meant something a little bit different. The locals' corner of the Savoy Ballroom. When Frankie was hanging out there, and he's looking across, this was the place that they would be night after night after night. This was their hangout. When he's looking across the ballroom and he sees a hot girl, he talks about this. And he would make his way across the ballroom in his the way Frankie tells his stories, I can even come close. But he, in his Frankie Manning way, yeah, man, he really had that cool character. And when he took that girl on the floor, the last dance on his mind is the Lindy Hop. Hell no. He wants to hold her. He wants to social dance. And he would do their style of foxtrotting, which is often called at that point, in the 30s anyways, the Savoy Walk, which is just a slow, quick. But I think we have to, again, put this in context, And also, they would also warn, their idea of social dancing is very different than ours. And they say, watch out for those waltzes, because you might end up married, So there's a time, Lindy Hop was reserved for your dance partner when you want to get down and show off, and, and another interesting thing, I'm sorry I'm bouncing around everywhere, but the house attendance, the big band that had the biggest attendance at the Savoy Ballroom was Guy Lombardo and his Canadian something or other. Let me think. Guy Lombardo. That's all you need to know. But he's a very sweet band. And interesting to note, in the late 30s, when you had all of these I call them the first generation of jazz and music shellac collectors. The first generation. The guy from Paris, France, came over. I'm not sure if Leonard Feather was one of them or not, but they're going through attics all through Harlem. Attics, closets, what do we call it? Yard sales types of things, but they would do these on the front steps of their brownstone places, and they're looking for rare shellac records. And they talk about all they found was Guy Lombardo records. Now, how is that possible, you know? Well, I'll tell you how it's possible. The majority of America during the Depression wasn't really looking to cut loose. The majority of Americans were looking for just a good social time to relax. Times weren't good. No one had money. And holding somebody in your arms and slowly cruising across the floor meant something a little more than what it does today. Whether you're in love or you're looking to be in love, it doesn't really matter. But one of the interesting things Guy Lombardo says about his band, why his band became so successful, Guy Lombardo, and he had brothers, his first recordings were in 1917. The last recordings of the Guy Lombardo band, 1977. He outsold every single one of those hot bands by far. And how is that possible? Well, the reason it is, and I think, and it was also said to be Louis Armstrong's favorite band, because this was the background music of America. It was the background, and I think that's the best way I've ever heard it or read it being described. It's not necessarily the music you want to go to see and then hang on the stage. Well, that's the Count Basie and the Ella Fitzgeralds and the Artie Shaws and the Jimmy Lunsfords. But the Guy Lombardo music, that's the music that's always going on. It's the background music. And I've always thought that would be a very interesting way to look at it, but how absolutely factual that is. And when Guy Lombardo talked about what made his band so famous, because it was because of Guy Lombardo that all the other sweet bands tried to copy him. And what he said was, for his band, what made his band so famous was he played for social dancing. And for him, that means you must play at a low enough volume that the couples are able to talk. That's social dancing. So that's a whole different, once again, whoa, we live in a different time, don't we? And so, but that was if I'm not mistaken, I think Guy Lombardo playing at the Savoy Ballroom was around 1932 or 33. And I think it was over 20,000 people that wanted to get in, and it only fits a few thousand people. And if I'm not mistaken, also, Frankie would, because he's a local, he had a way to sneak people in the Savoy through the back and up something and through the kitchen or something. And so Frankie was always sneaking people in. And but Frankie absolutely loved that music. And unfortunately, we only hired Frankie to teach, his Lindy stuff. But I like to think of a story from 1999, New Year's Eve, when we had 400 Lindy Hoppers in Mexico for the countdown of New Year's Eve. And Frankie Manning gets on the microphone to all of us, and he says, the first dance of the year is always a waltz. Well, you had 400 Lindy Hoppers go, oh, shit. And so the whole ballroom was following Frankie Manning around the room doing the waltz, But he goes, I love the waltz, But I don't know where I'm going with this, but the diversity was just so fantastic. Getting back to the Savoy, something that's very interesting about the Savoy is they redecorated the ballroom at least every 2 years. Complete new interior. I think they replaced the floor every 2 years as well. Might have been 2 or 4 years, but they had to literally replace the floor. The decorations, as I said, the interior was completely remodeled. And they had so many different types of events there that have really nothing to do with Lindy Hop. They had, dance floor shows, comedy shows. The Savoy could be rented out for different functions as well, especially during the week. But this changed over the course of over the years. One of the cool things that Sugar Sullivan and Sugar and Barbara talk about was they'd have square dances at the Savoy Ballroom. They would bring in huge amounts of straw, bales of hay, and make the place look like a giant barn. And everybody would dress up accordingly, like it's a big hillbilly hoedown, and they would have absolute square dancing. Like, I would just love a photo of that. Please, somebody give me a photo of that. So this is, it was a dance. So when you asked, people like Sugar, when I first met Sugar around 99 at an event in England, and she wasn't actively teaching that much, but she did a little bit. And it wasn't until around 2003 that I invited her to be my partner, and we started teaching together. And I remember at the time she was 74, and she kicked my ass. She could dance so fast. Oh, and the thing is when we were demonstrating, it wasn't just demonstrating at tempo. Sugar, this is how you learned at the Savoy Ballroom. You never would slow music down to learn. You learn it at the tempo and what you're going to dance it. Number one. And you just did it over and over and over and over until you got it. And she's going to be right there beside you, as they were for her. So you're the person helping you learn, they're going to be doing it with you. And you're going to do it right beside them until you get it. That's how they helped each other. But they would never slow it down. And that killed me. Absolutely killed me. Because we'd have to demonstrate it, and then, of course, put the music on for the students and the class, and it was just like over and over and over. And at 74, dancing to songs like, what was that Chick Webb song? Harlem something or other, 190 beats a minute. At 74, yeah, forget about it. This is what the Savoy is all about. I remember Sugar telling me the very first time she wanted to be in the Harvest Moon Ball, she missed the qualifying preliminary at the Savoy Ballroom. So she ran downtown to Roseland and entered the competition at Roseland Ballroom. And she won down there. She got good enough to make it to the Harvest Moon Ball, the finals. And one of the interesting things she said to me when I asked her, for instance, what does the word Savoy style mean to you? And she said to me, well, the difference between, because Savoy style, she said, it depends on what you're comparing it to. And, well, if you compare it to the other ballrooms, Roseland Ballroom, because I competed with Roseland my very first year, and at the Harvest Moon Ball, the very first thing that each ballroom, the 5 winners of those ballrooms, they would first compete just with themselves. Each one of them would go on the floor, which is a raised podium floor that kind of looks a little bit like an overgrown boxing ring. And it's bigger, but it's a raised floor in the center of this place. And the competing dancers, they would rehearse with the band. And of course, it was different big bands every year. Fletcher Henderson was one of those bands, I remember. And she said when these other ballrooms were rehearsing, they were rehearsing at whatever. They would pick a song, and that was what they did. But then when the Savoy dancers went on to rehearse, they were so fast. They were rehearsing so fast. And she said, that's where I want to be. That's where I want to be. So to her, Savoy style was a tempo thing. The Savoy dancers were much, much faster dancers than what the other ballrooms were doing. And of course, the finalists would all come together, and that's how they would, of course, get their final winners. Needless to say, Sugar Sullivan eventually did win. I think she was in it a couple times, and she ended up winning with her husband, George, in 1954-ish, I'm going to say. I'm not sure. I think it's 54, 55 maybe. But I think there was a big dancer that won right around that time as well. And thankfully, Sugar's still around. So if you really want to talk to a real Savoy Ballroom dancer, I think you should talk to Sugar. Message her on Facebook, or Barbara, or Sonny Allen even. Yeah, Sonny Allen. I've been mentioning Sonny Allen this week, oddly enough, a couple times for a very simple, short story. And it pertains to the classes we were doing, and also it's a reflection of what it's like dancing in here at night. As you all know, it's rather crowded, to say the least. And everybody's dancing rather big, to say the least. And but it's not unique to here. I promise you that. It's all over the world. And most famously in Harang Dance Camp in the main Folketshus, the main ballroom. Everybody knows it's almost like a MMA competition, UFC Lindy. And one of these nights in their ballroom, they usually have off to the side. They have a little riser and a couple nice chairs that look like thrones for a king and a queen, and that's where the legends get to sit at night. Sonny Allen, of course, being one, and Sugar. Over the years, there's been many people that have graced those chairs: Norma Miller, Frankie Manning, Don Hampton, and on and on and on. And one of these nights, I happened to be sitting next to down, not on the throne, I'm down low, but I'm next to Sonny nonetheless. And Sonny, he bumps me and says, "Hey, Peter," he goes, "can I ask you a question?" I go, "Yeah, of course, Sonny. What's up?" He goes, he points to the whole ballroom, which is going frantically crazy. And he goes, "You see how they're dancing?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why are they dancing like that?" I go, I was like, what do you mean? You know, everybody's swinging out, doing Lindy Hop, you know, going crazy. He goes, yeah, but they're not being paid. So that's a little bit, you know, once again, there's the, you know, that's how a Savoy ballroom dancer would look at it compared to what we're doing today, too. So we're a little detached. That's for whatever, you know, it's just an observation. Let's just put it that way, just an observation. But Sonny's a great guy. As I mentioned, the music changed over the course of the Savoy ballroom as well. And of course, in the later 40s into the 50s, probably the most popular band was Buddy Johnson Orchestra. And the biggest, which it's still swing music, but you get a lot more blues, a lot more slower tempos as well. You don't get a whole lot, but there is some bebop, absolutely. And that was the birth of where you have a lot more, where swing dancing halftime became commonplace. Whereas in the 30s, it was very unusual to see that, as I mentioned in the movie Keep Punching, to see the dancers dancing halftime. But the bebop era, it becomes very normal, very common to dance halftime, to take a break. Whether a whole song or a part of the song, it becomes very, very normal. Another thing that becomes very different is through the early years, they were doing, one band would play so many different styles of music. And so it wasn't just tempos, but it was also rhythm. So the dancers accommodated that by doing different dances. I mentioned the Savoy walk, which is more of their way to do you could say the foxtrot. But they also did a lot of one-stepping, or what we call the Peabody. When the dance got really, really fast, they would do the Peabody, which is as I mentioned, a one-step, which is a step, step, step. And when Frankie and when the Whiteys Lindy Hoppers, when they would do it, they had, I mean, you got to remember, this was their every night hangout and stuff. So they're always looking for ways to have fun and make a night exciting. And one of the things they would do as just friends, they would race. So they would race around the ballroom floor. And if you put that into context, though, it's a very interesting thing, because we're all stepping to the same tempo, right? Nobody's dancing faster or slower. It's the same tempo. So in order to win or to be faster, you have to take bigger steps. And taking big steps, sure, you can do that by yourself if you're wearing track shoes, but dancing with a partner in leather-soled shoes takes an insane amount of ability and skills. And that's an incredible amount. I can't even begin to explain how difficult that really, really is, unless you have to try, and you'll find out very quickly. It is extremely difficult to take giant steps on a slippery floor wearing leather-soled shoes, racing around the floor while doing turns. That's an incredible amount of ability. So these Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, they were not just good Lindy Hoppers. They were fantastic partner dancers and stop end. They were good, very, very, very good dancers in everything they did. They knew connection. And that's one of the things I think is very important as all of us being Lindy people, is to kind of go a little easy on yourselves when you're trying to learn this dance and you don't come from a dance background. If you don't have a dance background and you just step into a Lindy Hop track level 1 class as your first time, that's a hell of a challenge. You got to keep in mind all of those other dancers like Whitey's and all of that generation, I would say, they all learned dancing how to do the basics first. And what I mean by the basics is at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, they learned how to do the basic box step, two-step, waltz. At home, local school, local church, local rec center, all over the community. This is what everybody that generation, not just in Harlem, but all over America, as kids, this is what you learned. And this was your cotillion. This is what your class was. So they understood, and Frankie talks a little bit about this in his book. And so they already had an idea of how to keep their feet underneath them. They already knew how to make a connection, you know. And then they migrated and evolved into learning how to do bigger, greater, fantastic things, eccentric things. So go easy on yourself if you've never done anything before in your life and you're just diving into, you've chopped off all the fundamental basics and foundations of partner dancing and you're going for the king of them all from the top. It's like, I want to learn, I've never danced before, but I want to learn how to do Hell's a-Poppin'. You know, that's insane. So if you're struggling, don't worry about it. You're right where you need to be, but just keep in mind that even those dancers in Hell's a-Poppin', they all started with these basics, those basic box steps and so forth. And so when you see those, you know, when you see that picture of the Savoy Ballroom with packed floor of thousands of people dancing more or less body to body or semi-closed position, the majority of that dance room is all doing a basic box step or two-step social dancing, you know, and they're waiting for that fast tempo where there's room, or they're waiting for one of their friends to make room and create a jam session style environment. Herbert White did do this every Wednesday night for at least 3 or 4 years in the late 30s. Wednesday nights at the Savoy Ballroom, they would put on a whole floor show to show off his Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. Now, he did this obviously because of the attendance of the Savoy Ballroom. It was a #1 destination for many, many people during the late 30s and earliest 40s. Hollywood stars, international tourists, everybody. When you went to New York, you went to the Savoy Ballroom. You've heard so much about the bands, you've heard so much about the music, and of course the dancers. That's where everybody went. And of course, being a good marketing person that Herbert White was, he would show off his skills, his talent on the floor, on Wednesday nights. One particular individual that I became good friends with, who's no longer with us anymore, but his name was Paul Perini. He was an Italian, first-generation Italian immigrant. He lived in Brooklyn, but at 5 years old, he was goofing around at the end of the F line, which is one of the trains in New York, and unfortunately, he lost his leg with the train accident. His older sister, Mary, continued to teach him how to partner dance. He became a fantastic dancer, a very good dancer, and like everybody in the boroughs of New York, whether it's the Bronx or any of the surrounding areas, of course, once you get good at whatever it is you do, the place to test what you do is the Savoy Ballroom. And this goes as well with the shag dancers. The collegiate, today we would call them collegiate shag dancers, but they just called it the 6-count shag dancers that the dance, you guys all know what I'm talking about. They danced at a place called the Ford Ballroom. And once those dancers got really, really good, they thought they would go uptown to the Savoy and show them how good they are. And of course, they all said the same thing. They were all pretty much humbled when they stepped through the doors at the Savoy Ballroom. For Paul Perrine, who I mentioned, the one-legged dancer, he became a fantastic Lindy dancer. He never used an artificial leg. He always used a crutch under his arm. And he became part of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers for a number of years. And in 40 or 41, he won first place at the Savoy Ballroom preliminaries. He beat out Norma. He beat out everybody. He did a tour of the South with Whitey's Lindy Hoppers around 42, I believe it is, shortly thereafter. And unfortunately, due to the racism and segregation of America, especially in the Deep South at that time, it was too dangerous for them as a performance group to have any type of mixed performers on stage. And so Herbert White sent Paul Perrine home. Most of you don't know the name Paul Perrine because that's his birth name, and that's not the name he went by. Milton Berle gave him his nickname, and his nickname was Jimmy Valentine. So Jimmy went home and kind of heartbroken at that point because everything that revolved around dancing, that meant everything to him. And some circumstances happened and work involved. He moved to Los Angeles. And everybody I talked to in Los Angeles, all the swing dancers from that time period in Los Angeles, many of you have probably heard the name Irene Thomas, of course, Jean Veloz, Venna Archer, the original Ray Rand dancers. Everybody that knew Jimmy Valentine, every single woman, when I mentioned her, he eventually, about 10 years after that, he moved to Las Vegas in the 50s and then disappeared. So no one had seen him since the swing era until I came along and started asking everybody, did you ever meet Jimmy? Because I was talking to Jimmy every night on the phone. And every single old-timer, they would sigh, oh, Jimmy. He was a good-looking guy. He was a fantastic, the greatest dancer they ever felt. You would never know he had one leg. There is a clip of him online, by the way, in the 80s, dancing on his one leg with the swing dancing. And I believe he might even be dancing with Sylvia Sykes. I don't remember. It's either Sylvia or another, doesn't matter. But yeah, he would dance with his crutch. His crutch was like his leg. He would use his, crutch as a leg. But when the tempo got really, really fast, he would just slide his crutch off the floor. And he did it all. Air steps, you name it, everything, one-legged. I don't know why I got on that, but he's an important foundational fact of one of the links of what I know of the Savoy Ballroom is through Jimmy Valentine, and what a sweetheart he was. He was very lonely in his latter part of his life. And the interesting thing is every time I would hang up the phone after talking with him, he'd love to talk on the phone. And he would always say to me when we hung up the phone, don't forget those three little words. I would just, okay, no problem, Jimmy. Take care. I'll talk to you tomorrow or the next day, and we'd hang up. And this went on for a couple years. It went on for he said, don't forget those three little words. And this went on for a couple of years until I saw a Vitaphone short of a band. The orchestra was named Skinny Ennis Orchestra, and there's a couple swing dancing in this. It's an L.A. couple, famous L.A. couple. Jack Arkin and Marion Goldie are the couple in that. And the song is dun 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 dun, dun. And the camera shoots them. I think they come lollying into the picture or something. But in the beginning, the camera goes over the sheet music, and it says those three little words. And it hit me. What? And what are those three little words? I love you. So for years, Jimmy was telling me this when he was hanging up the phone. And I didn't even know that. He goes, don't forget those three little words. I love you. So that's just an interesting story and shows you the compassion and love that a guy from that era had. Something that will always stick with me of how you don't always catch things on the first time through. And sometimes it takes a number of years before you realize what they're talking about. But he was a true hep cat. Getting back to Lombardo and that kind of a thing was the music. They did all these different dances in the Savoy Ballroom in the early years. But over the decades, as the decades change, by the time you get to the bands like Buddy Johnson, the house band, the great Buddy Johnson house band, now you have generations of people that are doing more swing dancing the whole night. Not so much the Peabody anymore, not so much the waltzes anymore, not so much the foxtrots anymore. It's all just swing dancing. And when I first started dancing with Sugar, she talked about it, what we all do here, she talked about it just, we're swing dancers. I'm a dancer, and I dance to whatever the music is. I like this dance, this dance, this dance, this dance. But they didn't really use the term Lindy Hop like we do today. It was my generation, the younger generation, asking them, yeah, but you're swing dancing, but isn't that the Lindy Hop? She go, oh, well, yeah, it's the old Lindy Hop. But they looked at it differently than, let's say, the Frankie generation, where we're like, no, the Lindy Hop. It is the only, we are the king of the, So our swing, because swing dancing meant something a little bit, could mean something different in the 30s. You got to remember, every city had its own style of eccentric type of swing dancing. Some of it came from Charleston, some of it came from foxtrotting or box stepping, some of it came from something more like a shag. The word shag just means dance. That's confusing, right? You got St. Louis shag, Carolina shag, all these different shags. Are they related? No. Shag just means dance. It could be related to another dance. It might not be related to another dance. Carolina shag, we do know for a fact, is related to the style of dancing they were doing in New York. And it was the vacationers going down the coast from New York to the Carolinas and dancing on, of course, the beaches. It became slower. I'm giving you a very, very short story. It became slower, more simple, and it turned into what we know today as Carolina shag. But then you have St. Louis shag. That's a completely different dance. That's obviously a Charleston-based type of dance. And also, when you think about, I'll give you a good example. When the Big Apple, as we all know, the Big Apple comes from the Big Apple Club. It's named after an actual venue that was called the Big Apple. The story, in a nutshell, the story of the Big Apple was it was a black club, black dancers in the South, so it was segregated. But these younger dancers, these young white dancers, heard the music, and they really, really, really wanted to see what was going on and see the dancing in there. And so I don't know if it was the doorman or the ticket person, but they made a deal, said, okay, you can go in, but you got to stay upstairs in the wings, and you can watch from the balconies, but you can't be on the main floor. So these white dancers went in there, and they watched what these black kids were doing. And it was, obviously they were taking notes, and they were doing what would become the Big Apple. And but the reason it gets the name the Big Apple, it's just because of what these white kids were doing. Once they left and they started doing this dance, people asked them, what are you doing? And they said, well, it's the Big Apple. It comes from this is the club we got it at. So they're just naming it after the club in which they got it, giving dues to where they got the ideas. But if anybody knows how the Big Apple, the calls of the Big Apple, it's there's an individual that's calling all the steps. And when you do the Big Apple, you usually, somebody's going to say, let's all do the Big Apple. And everybody's the couples, you're still in a couple. You're still dancing as couples, but it's multiple couples in a circle. You hold hands, they say right foot in, and everybody taps their right foot, and then the caller will say, swing out. But what is swing out? It's what you all probably call Charleston. But this isn't Charleston. This is swing. I'm swing. My movement is swing. Charleston, we forgot it. Charleston is a rhythm. You can call it an American, well, it's Latin influenced, of course, but it's a bop, 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 bop. That's a Charleston rhythm. Bum, ba, bum, 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 da, 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 da. It's a clave rhythm. Without that clave rhythm, it's not Charleston anymore. So you dance in twos. It's pop, pop, and then pop, pop. But you have the Lindy Hoppers, the Frankie Manning generation. They're taking that original Charleston and they're swinging it. But unfortunately, they still called it Charleston. There's the dilemma. There's the problem. Although Frankie would call it Long Charleston, but technically it's not Charleston anymore. And that's something I learned from Leonard Reed. Many of you know If you don't know who Leonard Reed is, he invented the shim sham, along with his partner Willie Bryant, so that you might know him from that. But he was also a two-time national Charleston champion. He was a manager of the Apollo Theater for 30 years. He was the first African American on the Professional Golf Association tour. He's one of those guys that just lived multiple lives that we can never possibly live up to. But he talks a lot about the Charleston and how it originally was done. There was very little to it, and how they all practiced by tying. You would practice at home by tying your knees together. And he said the life expectancy, or the dance life expectancy of a Charleston dancer was very short, just a year or two, because they would blow out their knees and their hips. And there was so much money involved in all those contests in the 20s, everybody was really, really going for it. So people didn't take care of their own health. Anyways, how are we on time? We're pretty good. Yeah, not so bad. As you can tell, I can go on and on and on and on. But I'm bouncing all over the place because all these stories are to me in my life, in my dance, it's always been interlinked. They're all connected. And every little story is a little ingredient that kind of shares the importance of the culture that surrounds this building called the Savoy Ballroom. But I would like to maybe answer some questions if I can. If I don't know, I will point you to maybe who can. But and I know I had some questions in classes earlier today. I said, hold it, save it for later. Is there any curiosities that you might have about the Savoy or anything related to what I might have talked about? Yes, sir. Okay, good question. No, Frankie didn't invent it. Frankie is credited for a lot of great things and first-time things, but not specifically the Lindy Hop. Now, the Lindy Hop was there were steps already being done. And unfortunately, we don't have these steps on video. And so it leaves a gap. But there's a dance called the collegiate, and there's a dance called the hop. We have an idea of, just because of the variables and the options possible for us at that time, we have an idea of what it had to come from this, or this, you know. So we kind of have an idea. And then we also have the movie After 7, 1929. So we can kind of go, well, this is either called the hop, or this might be what they were calling the collegiate, or this might be called. So we have an idea, but there is no 100% factual, this is it. Unfortunately, because After 7 is just a music video with dancing in it, and it doesn't say anything like, this is such and such. So we're making assumptions. Assumptions are dangerous, especially in academia, but they're educated nonetheless. But it was during a marathon dance competition in the 1920s in Harlem. So just put that into perspective. During a marathon, people would like to do often, watching these marathons, would throw money or encourage the dancers to perform or show off. This did two things. One, obviously, it's very entertaining. Two, it shortens the marathon. During this time, there was a couple. I believe he was wearing number 7. I'm going by memory. I don't remember, but I think it was number 7. But it was George Snowden, a.k.a. Shorty George, and he was dancing with Mattie Purnell. And while he was doing his little show-off period, he accidentally slipped his hand off of her, and she went out into open position It was a mistake, and he pulled her back in, and they kept dancing. He repeated this, and this is what was the breakaway. The first, what they called the first, correct, what we would call swing out today. But it was utilizing that movement that allowed the follower to improvise on that, what we would say today, 6, 7, 8, 1. There was improvisation, which had not really been done in any type of dancing at that point in America. I'm pretty safe. I'm going on a limb, but don't hang me. If you find anything else where I'm wrong, please message me. But I am safe to say that's the first time in American history where we have improvisational dancing being done within a partner dance. Now, it was, I can't remember if it was a newspaper or radio personality that was interviewing George at that time. And the story goes, he looked down at a piece, when they asked him, what is it that you were doing? He looked down at a piece of newspaper and saw what the headline said. And it said, Lindy Hop's the Atlantic. And he turned around to the radio producer and said, I'm doing the Lindy Hop. So how much of that is 100% true? We don't really know, but there's a lot of evidence that does go towards that, number one. We have found that a guy by the name of Peter from Chicago did find that newspaper that in fact does say that, because there was a lot of Lindbergh Hops the Atlantics. There's a lot of those. But finding the Lindy Hops was a hard one. But so there is that newspaper. But the more credible, the story that really kind of makes it more credible to me is when Frankie talks about it. Frankie was sitting there with all their local dancers, standing around in a group, all good friends, right? All good friends. And Frankie asked and talks to George about this, about, you named this the Lindy Hop. And George, yeah, I named this the Lindy Hop. And the way Frankie tells the story, he goes, everybody that was there was really good friends of George. And if there was any possibility whatsoever that he was lying or making something up, they would have put him in check right there and then. And they didn't. And I've been in situations like that just with my own friend groups, you know, where you have one friend kind of stretch a story. The other friends usually, you know, come on, bro. You know, that's not what happened. But so putting that all together, that's more than whether the newspaper was there or not. Let's just say, let's just say remove that one part of the story, still it remains that Shorty George was in fact one of the greatest dancers in Harlem of that time, by far, along with a couple others that are also possibly in that movie. And so the story of the Lindy Hop becoming Lindy Hop is historically accurate, that Shorty George did name the dance. There's also very good interviews with Shorty George in Marshall Stern's book called Jazz Dance, which came out around 1963. So there's other things as well that kind of point there. So that's my answer to you about Frankie Manning making up. The usual story that we hear that's mistold about Frankie Manning is usually Frankie Manning invented the air step. That's the modern day Lindy Hop rumor story. But if you knew Frankie 30 years ago, when he tells it, no, it's Frankie Manning saw Shorty George and Big B, his other partner, do a trick in I don't know if it was on stage performing or it was in a competition, but you can find it online. And it's Shorty George is obviously a short guy, and Big B was his partner was very big. And they would lock arms back to back, and she would pick him up in the air, and he would kick his feet, and she would walk with George. And so Frankie saw that and said, wouldn't that be a cool move if you would keep going over the top and land on your feet? So Frankie took that idea from George, and he created his own step out of that. Also, there's Ethel Waters, the famous singer. She talks about, I don't remember where this is, if it's in a book, but she talks about Small's Paradise in 1931, and Shorty George, he had his own dance team of Lindy Hoppers. They were competitors of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. These were the two rival teams. But in 1931 at Small's Paradise, I don't remember if she was rehearsing for something or whatever, but she saw them, and she describes what they were doing as airlifts. So we know they were already doing airlifts by 1931. Anyways, getting back to Frankie, he gets that idea of what, takes that to one neck, and he practiced on the roof of his house. They had a bed mattress at the top floor of the roof of their apartment building where they would practice, and they had a mattress, and so they practiced over the back. And so what happened was in 1934, there was a big rivalry between Shorty George's dancers and the Herbert White's dancers. And they went out, couple at a time, one at a time, like b-boy battle, basically, with couples. This couple, this couple, this couple, this couple. And of course, the last two couples is going to be Frankie. And at the same time, they're dancing to Chick Webb. And because Chick Webb is such a fantastic drummer, what drummers are able to do, as many of you can imagine, is watching the dancers, the drummers can make everything really, really good for you or really, really bad for you. And what I mean by that is simply when you're doing an air step and the drummer's watching you, but when you hit the floor, it's, hit the ride or hit the bass drum or hit something and accentuate your dancing. Well, it was in that moment, this critical moment of this battle, in which Frankie Manning went last, and for the very first time at the Savoy Ballroom, there was this air step over the back, bam, and with Chick Webb, and the story is the ballroom went absolutely bananas and crazy. So that's Frankie's story. So Frankie's story is he's the first one to do a real air step at a Savoy Ballroom in a contest. But as the story grows and grows and grows, it becomes the first one to do an air step at the Savoy. And then it becomes the first one to ever do an air step. And so it's just how life is. It's nobody's fault. It's oral. That's the problem with oral history is we always try to make it better and better and better as we share it with our excitement. And come to find out, I worked with Cynthia Millman just a little bit on Frankie's book. She was the co-author of Frankie's book. And one of the dilemmas we had was I have this clip from the mid-1920s of these collegiate foxtrot dancers on stage dancing. And they do the back-to-back air step. And she didn't, she was in Cynthia was in a dilemma, do we mention that or not? But, because obviously the Savoy dancers had never seen it before, never heard of it before. My recommendation was don't even mention it because it's irrelevant, And, but, it just goes to show you, with 2 feet and 4 beats of music, there's only so much you can do before you start repeating what somebody else already did, And, but it's still a very important question you asked, so I'm glad you asked it for sure, because not to take away, because Frankie is still the king as far as I'm concerned. Questions? Yes, sir. Mattie, M-A-T-T-I-E, Purnell. P-U-R-N-E-L, I believe is how it's spelled. Mattie with an M. M as in mom, and Purnell as in Paul or Peter. No problem. Question in the back. The evolution of swing music. Yeah, well, I'm going to be a little biased, obviously, but because, as everybody already knows, the big bands fell out of flavor in the late 40s. Most of them had stopped sometime in the 40s. Some big bands continued to squeeze out as many possible bookings and gigs as they could. Even Count Basie stopped playing around 1950. So swing, as the swing era bands are concerned, that whole idea more or less stopped being popular. what you had is you had some musicians, all the musicians went different directions. A lot of the star players went into bebop, for instance. Early bebop, I mean, the rhythm swings hard. It's great swing music. Obviously, the tempos are a little different. They start playing their instruments a little different. They start, as we joke, start flattening their fifths. And as you know, if you go to places like Birdland, very famous club that's still in existence, Birdland, it's kind of the epicenter for bebop. I mean, there is all the 52nd Street stuff too, but Birdland becomes the epicenter, talking about Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and but as you many of you might know, maybe you don't know, if you look behind the stage at Birdland, I don't remember what the sign says exactly, but it says something to the effect of no dancing. Yeah, it's time to sit and watch and worship us. So it was a lot of musicians that didn't want to be utilitarian, put in chains, as they might think of it as playing for dancers. But then you also had bands like, what's his name? They start going into, well, I mentioned Buddy Johnson. I'll think of it in a second. He was a house band at the Savoy in the early 40s, and he started playing more R&B, jump blues style, because that was where the trend was going for dancing. It was going into more of the jump blues, rhythm and blues. And then, of course, which gives way to eventually becoming rock and roll. That was one of the beautiful things about rock and roll of the 1950s, is it gave the youth something to dance to again. Whereas if you look at the flip side of that, where you look at people like Count Basie, and you take songs like 1 O'Clock Jump, right? Super simple riff, very, very, like you don't even need to write down on what the arrangement is. Him as a band leader, he can just tell the boys to do this simple 3-chord, do this little riff. Now you guys do this. Now you guys do this. Now let's just cut Lester Young loose over the front. We'll take turns soloing on this. That's basically what the song was like in the 1930s. That was what made Basie so great. It was very easy to listen to, that music. Especially if you compare it to the previous music of these incredibly difficult arrangements that were being played in the late 20s and early 30s, whether it's Jelly Roll Morton's band or even King Joe Oliver's band, who was in competition to play. Who actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, had the job to play at the Cotton Club but turned it down. Thank God, because then Duke Ellington came in, and but again, Duke Ellington's arrangements, super complicated, Duke Ellington was really never known as a dance band. There's a very famous story about Frankie Manning performing at the Apollo Theater with Duke Ellington. And Duke saying, so what do you guys want to dance to? And Frankie says, you know this song? And he sings it. And Duke says, yeah, what, do you have any more? He goes, yeah, what about this one? This song. He sings it, and he goes, okay, that's pretty good. What about this song? And finally Duke goes, is there any songs that I do that you'd like to? Because it wasn't considered a dance, not in the hot sense of the terms. He was a great band, but that's just not what they, But then now take those same Count Basie recordings from his very first sessions. I believe they were Decca. Now look at how he records those same records in the late 50s, I think on Roulette Records. Same songs. Go listen to those. You're going to hear a completely different, because now his audience is sitting down. So that same simple riff that's super easy to listen to with someone soloing in it doesn't work anymore because they're not dancing. They're all sitting there drinking with wine, staring at you, staring at the musicians, at their face. So now he's taken simple riff songs, like 1 O'Clock Jump as an example, and he's made these incredible arrangements out of them with modulations and turnarounds and, and they're just super complicated. So that would be that's the evolution of classic big band swing. While most of America had moved on, it was dancing to the current pop music of the times. So the pop music of the 30s was swing music, sure, but then it goes into R&B or jump blues, rhythm and blues type of music, and then it slowly gets into more of a rock and roll beat, and it has a heavy 2/4 backbeat too. That's another thing. Listen to the rhythm section of Count Basie's band. The first rhythm section, you can't get better. That's the best rhythm section that's ever existed, with Walter Page on bass, Joe Jones on drums, Freddie Green on guitar. Like, those guys as a unit, you just can't get a better rhythm section. But then you get to the late 50s, and he has this rim shot, click track, almost computer click. It's so swinging that there's no more pulse. It's just flat. And whereas rock and roll brings back that heavy beat. Sometimes it's a little bit heavy on the two backbeat, which you hear like a lot in rockabilly, for instance. But that's easy, really nice and easy to dance to, So what America was dancing to, the dancers kind of left that in a certain way, Now, there are exceptions to that. There are absolute exceptions to that rule, because a lot of those bands did continue doing dance engagements, but it wasn't very often. It was once every so, playing a dance, oh, cool. Finally, we get to get in front of dancers again. That's what some dance bands would actually say that, while other bands were like, nah, we don't really want to do that anymore. And the same thing could be said for the New Orleans revival bands of the 1940s, when you had dance researchers, historians going to the South around New Orleans and the parishes down there, and trying to find and locate where all these old musicians are that never recorded. And you got people like Bunk Johnson come out of the woodworks, he's working in a field as a farmer or something, and they're like, hey, you're this guy. You played, you played before there was such a thing as jazz, and can you still play? He's like, well, if you buy me teeth and a horn, maybe I can. And all of a sudden, there's this huge revival all through the 40s of these black musicians that never had the opportunity before. Bunk Johnson, I mentioned, Kid Chic, you have George Lewis on clarinet, you have all of these legends come out of the woodworks. And all through the 40s and 50s, where are they playing? They're playing college campuses for dancers. New Orleans jazz. Heavy 4 to the bar, stomp, not swing, it's stomp, 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 stomp. And it's collective improvisation, which is another thing. The public never understood at the time what collective improvisation is. And that's something you hear with some of these early bands like King Joe Oliver, with early Louis Armstrong, we didn't know what to make of it. You have the trumpet playing the root note, the melody. Then you have the clarinet just noodling around him, improvising, playing the third. And then whenever anybody takes a breath, here comes the trombone, filling in the background on the fifth. That was too much information. When those bands first went to New York in 1919, they didn't know what to do to it. The guys on stage, hey, this is dance music down south. They didn't know. New York had no clue. It wasn't until later that actual, music nerds 10 years later go, wait a minute, listen to what they're actually playing. Trumpet's playing the root, the melody, clarinet's playing the third, trombone's playing the fifth. That's a chord. These guys don't even know how to read music. How is it possible that they can play chords at this tempo, improvising this fast? Holy shit. And then it becomes respected and understood. And in the 40s, we have the phenomenon where now those bands are playing across America and things like that. But anyways, I think it's a good time to wrap it up. As you guys know, I will go on and on and on. But you guys, first off, it's obviously, without you, this wouldn't be possible. Your curiosity was no different than me. I just started many, many, many years ago. But I'm just the same as you. I'm one of you. So it's a really cool opportunity for me to be able to share it in this kind of a casual atmosphere. Because I did do the university tour thing for years, 20 years ago. I didn't really like it because they didn't have the passion that you did. It was a bunch of bearded old dudes with clipboards. And none of them danced. Believe you me, it was horrible. For about 6 or 7 years, I did it with the State Department for the embassy. And once again, it was just a bunch of people just like, they didn't really care. And so and not only that, but there's no money involved. Not that I get paid here for this, I don't. I tell I'm more than happy to do this anytime because like I said, I'm one of you, and to share this information with people that like me that care and are curious, I think it's really important to just spill the beans a little bit in a casual environment and just tell some stories together and try to tie it in a way that can make us hit the floor with a little of a smile and be glad that we're here and be glad that we're healthy. Take care of yourselves and don't hurt yourselves, and so you can keep a really long, healthy dance life, because that's what keeps us young. And thank you guys very, very much.